What if the most dangerous spy in the Middle East wasn't a foreign agent who slipped across a border? What if he was already inside, eating at the same table, attending the same funerals, praying at the same mosques, for 20 years before anyone noticed? That's not a hypothetical. That's what happened inside Hezbollah. And the man at the center of it wasn't some ideological defector. He wasn't bought with a suitcase of cash in a European hotel room. He was someone who had given everything to the organization, who had expected something in return, who had waited and been told, quietly, firmly, repeatedly, that his time would not come. That moment of being told no is where this story actually begins. Hassan Nasrallah had not appeared in public since 2006, not once, not at funerals of commanders he had personally trained, not at the victory celebrations he ordered his fighters to hold in the streets, not at the weddings of his own movement's leadership. After Israel's war with Lebanon that year, Nasrallah gave a single interview and said something remarkable. He admitted that if he had known Israel's response would be what it was, he never would have ordered the kidnapping of 2 Israeli soldiers that started the conflict. Then he disappeared underground, literally, and did not resurface for 18 years. He moved through a network of reinforced bunkers beneath the southern suburbs of Beirut, the Dahieh district, a dense residential neighborhood where Hezbollah had spent decades building not just a military infrastructure, but a parallel city underneath the one above it. His circle was so small that senior commanders who had served under him for a decade sometimes didn't know which country he was in. Israel had been trying to kill him since 1997. They had come close twice. Both times the intelligence arrived too late by hours. By the early 2020s, the consensus inside Israeli military intelligence was uncomfortable, and clearly stated Nasrallah could not be reached from the outside. The only way in was through someone already inside. His name has never been officially confirmed. Lebanese press at the time, drawing on sources close to Hezbollah's internal security apparatus, identified him as Mohammed Shorba, a senior official, a man who had spent decades inside the organization's Foreign Operations Division. Not a foot soldier, not a bureaucrat, an officer who understood how Hezbollah moved money, how it moved people, and how it moved information across borders. In 2015, Nasrallah himself went on Lebanese television and confirmed what the press had been reporting for weeks. One of their own had been arrested, had confessed, had been working for Mossad for years. Nasrallah tried to contain the damage immediately. He said the reports of what had been revealed were very exaggerated. He said the man had nothing to do with the military structure of the resistance. What he did not explain, could not explain without admitting something far worse, was how the relationship had started. What had made a senior Hezbollah official, a man with everything to lose, decide to open that door? Lebanese security sources, speaking to journalists in the days after the arrest became public, described a motive that intelligence analysts who study defection recognize immediately. He hadn't been paid, he hadn't been blackmailed. He hadn't experienced some dramatic ideological conversion. He had been passed over for promotion, again, after years of service. After watching men he considered less capable rise to positions he believed were owed to him, he had raised it with his superiors. He had been heard and then quietly ignored. This is a pattern that intelligence services have studied for decades. Not the dramatic betrayal, not the sudden ideological break. The slow, grinding accumulation of small humiliations inside an organization that demands total loyalty while offering in return no mechanism for legitimate grievance. Inside Hezbollah, there was no HR department. There was no appeals process. There was no external body to approach. There was the chain of command, and the chain of command's decision was final. A man who felt wronged had exactly one option: accept it and continue. Every other path led somewhere the organization did not permit. What Mossad understood, and what Hezbollah's leadership apparently did not, was that men who have accepted humiliation publicly and swallowed it privately do not forget it. They carry it, and they carry it into every meeting, every briefing, every moment where they hold information that the organization values and they themselves do not feel valued. That gap between what a person knows and what they feel they are owed for knowing it is not a flaw in human nature. It is human nature, and it is, in the architecture of intelligence recruitment, a door. And then, through channels that were never fully established publicly, a relationship began. This is where the story gets difficult. Because in human intelligence, the kind that runs on relationships rather than satellites, the moment a recruitment begins is almost never the moment it looks like a recruitment. It doesn't start with an approach. It doesn't start with an offer. It starts with something that feels entirely ordinary, a business contact in a third country, a conversation that goes slightly longer than it should, a person who seems to understand, without being told, exactly what kind of frustration you're carrying. Mossad, by the 2000s, had developed what multiple former officials later described as a sophisticated system for identifying internal pressure points inside Hezbollah. Not just monitoring communications, though they were doing that extensively, but building a map of who inside the organization was angry, who felt sidelined, who believed the leadership had made catastrophic decisions and would never publicly admit it. They weren't looking for ideological converts. Those are unreliable and often unstable. They were looking for people with grievances specific enough to be real and contained enough to be manageable. A man who felt professionally humiliated, who had built his identity around service to the organization, who now found himself in the private hours asking what that service had actually been worth. That profile is not rare. It exists in every large, hierarchical, high-stakes organization in the world. The difference inside Hezbollah was what those men were carrying in their heads. What Shorba knew, if the Lebanese press identification is accurate, was not tactical. It wasn't missile coordinates or weapons caches, it was structural. He knew how Hezbollah compartmentalized information. He knew which internal security protocols were real and which were theatrical. He knew the rhythm of how leadership meetings were organized, who was told what and when, how decisions moved from Nasrallah downward through the chain. That kind of knowledge doesn't expire. It compounds. Because the people who built those systems don't redesign them completely every year. They patch them. They add layers. But the underlying architecture, the logic of how the organization thinks about its own security, stays largely intact. A source who understood that architecture from the inside was worth more than 100 intercepted phone calls. And Hezbollah, to its enormous cost, did not fully understand what had been taken until years later. But here is the question Nasrallah's 2015 television appearance quietly opened and never closed. He confirmed one mole. He named the damage as minimal. He called the arrest a demonstration of Hezbollah's vigilance. What he did not address, what no one in the organization's public statements ever addressed, was the obvious follow-on question. If Mossad had successfully recruited a senior official in foreign operations, someone who had passed through internal security vetting for years without detection, why would that be the only one? Recruitment in intelligence doesn't work like catching a single spy, and then the problem is solved. It works like finding one thread and pulling. The question isn't whether there was one person inside. The question is how many relationships were built, over how many years, using the same method. By 2022, something had shifted in the operational tempo. Hezbollah was 3 years removed from the economic collapse that had devastated Lebanon, a collapse many Lebanese blamed on Hezbollah's stranglehold over the state. The organization had been fighting in Syria for nearly a decade, grinding, costly, deeply unpopular among the same Shia communities it claimed to protect. Internally, the fractures were there if you knew how to read them. A senior officer who had served through the Syria years watching his organization make decisions he disagreed with. Watching resources disappear into a foreign war. Watching young men from southern Lebanese villages come home in boxes for a conflict that had nothing to do with the resistance against Israel that he had joined the organization to wage. Watching the leadership's justifications grow more elaborate, as the casualties grew more difficult to explain to grieving families who asked questions in private that nobody was permitted to ask in public. Watching the leadership's judgment, Nasrallah's judgment specifically, go publicly unquestioned while privately, in the conversations that happened between exhausted men at the end of long meetings, the doubts accumulated. That is where a recruitment years earlier starts to pay its longest dividend. Not in the intelligence the source produces immediately, in the intelligence they produce when the organization they belong to is tired and fractured, and starting to make the kinds of mistakes that tired, fractured organizations make. The question that nobody inside Hezbollah was asking loudly enough, the question that should have been asked after Shorba, and after the deaths of Mughnieh in Damascus and al-Lakis outside his home in Beirut, was simple. Who else did we not catch? In the summer of 2022, Hezbollah made a decision that, from the outside, looked like discipline. Hassan Nasrallah stood in front of his commanders and said something that would later read as one of the most consequential miscalculations in the organization's history. He told them their phones were more dangerous than Israeli spies. He told them to get rid of their smartphones, to go analog, to return to the kind of communications infrastructure that couldn't be hacked, couldn't be tracked, couldn't be turned against them. The men in that room believed he was right. The logic was sound. Smartphones had GPS. Smartphones had microphones. Smartphones could be remotely activated by intelligence services without the user ever knowing. Going back to pagers, simple, one-way, untrackable, felt like the mature, disciplined response to an enemy they knew was watching. What none of them understood was that the conversation leading to that decision had not been entirely their own. For years, Israeli intelligence had been doing something more sophisticated than surveillance. They had been learning, through intercepted communications and human sources, exactly what made Hezbollah feel unsafe, which technologies they distrusted, which vulnerabilities they were most anxious about, which internal security debates kept coming up in closed meetings, and then, quietly, they had been feeding that anxiety. Not with disinformation exactly, with emphasis, with carefully placed confirmations of fears Hezbollah already had. When Nasrallah warned his fighters about smartphones, he was drawing on real intelligence assessments. He was responding to genuine vulnerabilities, but the weight he placed on certain threats, the specific direction his thinking moved, had been, over time, shaped by information that came from sources he believed were his own. The decision to go analog felt like Hezbollah exercising control over its own security environment. It was, in part, Hezbollah walking toward a door that had been left open for them. By early 2024, Hezbollah had purchased 5,000 pagers from what they believed was a Taiwanese supplier, a company called Gold Apollo. The saleswoman who brokered the deal was someone they had worked with before, a known quantity, a reliable contact who had handled previous procurement without incident. She came with a recommendation and offered the first batch as a free upgrade. She was, according to former Mossad officers who spoke to CBS News in December 2024, entirely unaware that she was working for Israeli intelligence. That detail matters more than it might seem, because Hezbollah's internal vetting process wasn't compromised in this case through a turned agent or a bribed official. It was bypassed by using someone who had nothing to hide, because she genuinely didn't know what she was carrying. Her honesty under any scrutiny would have been perfect, because it was real. The pagers were assembled in Israel. Each one contained a concealed charge of PETN explosive. Each one was designed to detonate remotely, with a trigger mechanism that forced the user to hold the device with both hands, maximizing the damage to the person holding it. 5,000 of them moved into Hezbollah's logistics chain, were distributed to mid-level fighters and support personnel, were clipped onto belts and slipped into pockets across Lebanon, Syria, and beyond. For months, they functioned exactly as advertised. Inside Hezbollah's security apparatus, there was a man whose job, in part, was to worry about exactly this kind of scenario. His name was Wafik Safa. He ran Hezbollah's Liaison and Coordination Unit, the body responsible for relations with Lebanese security agencies, for managing the organization's relationship with the Lebanese state, for ensuring that Hezbollah's internal security wasn't being penetrated from directions the military wing wasn't watching. He was, by all accounts from sources close to the organization, a serious and experienced operator, not a figurehead, someone who had built his role over decades and understood that the most dangerous threats to Hezbollah were not the ones that came loudly from outside, but the ones that moved quietly through relationships and supply chains and the ordinary texture of institutional life. And somewhere in 2024, Safa's unit began picking up friction. The exact nature of what triggered the internal alarm has never been reported in full. What is known is this: by September 2024, someone inside Hezbollah's procurement and security chain had flagged the pagers for closer examination. Not the entire stockpile. Not a formal investigation with a clear chain of authority. Just a quiet, lateral movement of concern. The kind that happens inside large organizations when someone notices something they can't quite name but can't ignore either. 2 devices were sent to Iran for technical inspection. The people who made that decision probably believed they were being cautious, thorough, professionally responsible in exactly the way their roles required them to be. They had no idea they had just started a countdown. This is the reframe the story has been building toward. Everything Hezbollah believed it was doing right, the move to pagers, the procurement through trusted contacts, the internal security review, the decision to send devices to Iran for inspection, was either a product of Israeli manipulation or a response to Israeli manipulation. The caution was real, the discipline was real, the professionalism of the people raising concerns was real, and none of it mattered, because the threat was not coming from the direction they were trained to look. Hezbollah's entire security doctrine was built around the assumption that the danger was external, that the organization's internal culture, its ideological cohesion, its loyalty structures, its compartmentalization protocols, created a barrier that outside intelligence services could probe but not fully penetrate. What the Shorba case had shown in 2015 and what the organization had declined to fully absorb was that the barrier had a different kind of vulnerability. Not external penetration, internal erosion. The slow, invisible accumulation of individuals whose loyalty had been, for reasons entirely human and entirely understandable, quietly redirected. The pager operation worked not because Mossad was clever about technology. It worked because Mossad understood, better than Hezbollah's own leadership did, the internal psychology of the organization they were targeting. Inside the senior leadership in September 2024, there was a conversation happening that has never been fully reported. What is known from sources close to the organization is that the period between the flagging of the pagers and the detonation on September 17th was not calm. There were people raising questions. There were people arguing that the procurement chain needed to be reviewed more broadly, that the concern about the pagers was a symptom of something larger that hadn't been identified yet. Those conversations did not produce action fast enough. Partly because large organizations move slowly when the threat is ambiguous. Partly because acting on the concern would have meant admitting, at a leadership level, that the security architecture Nasrallah had spent 2 decades building might have been compromised in ways that couldn't be fixed by sending 2 pagers to Tehran. And partly, this is the part that matters most, because the doubt itself had been anticipated. A well-designed deception operation doesn't just create the deception. It creates the conditions under which the target will hesitate to act on their own suspicions. The uncertainty that Hezbollah's security apparatus felt in those weeks was not incidental. It was a feature. The question of what they actually knew and when, and whether the people who knew it fully understood what they were looking at, that question does not have a clean answer. And that absence of a clean answer is itself part of what was done to them. On September 11, 2024, someone inside Hezbollah's logistics chain did something that nearly ended the operation before it reached its peak. They put 2 of the pagers in a bag and sent them to Iran. Not because they had confirmed a specific suspicion, Not because an investigation had reached a conclusion, because someone, somewhere in the chain, felt something was wrong and acted on that instinct without announcing it through formal channels. The devices were sent quietly, the way concerns move inside organizations that punish the people who raise them incorrectly, carefully, through a side door, with minimal documentation. In Tel Aviv, when Israeli intelligence detected what had happened, the reaction was not calm. The operation that had taken 2 years to build, 5,000 devices distributed across Hezbollah's entire mid-level operational network, was now potentially 48 hours from exposure. Once Iranian technical teams examined the pagers closely enough, the PETN would be found. The shell company would unravel. The saleswoman's procurement chain would be traced backward. Everything would collapse, and Hezbollah would know not just that the pagers were compromised, but precisely how deeply Israel had penetrated their supply infrastructure. There were voices inside Israeli military intelligence that week arguing for a stand-down, for letting the operation go quiet, for accepting that the pagers had been a 2-year investment that had not reached its moment and could not be recovered now that Iran had the devices. The argument for aborting was not irrational. Detonating 5,000 devices simultaneously across Lebanon would be the largest single intelligence action Israel had taken in decades. The operational security of the entire supply chain would be exposed. The methods would be studied. Every Hezbollah procurement decision for the next generation would be shaped by the memory of what had happened. The element of surprise, once used, could never be used the same way again. There was also the question of what detonating the devices would do to the human intelligence architecture that had been built alongside the technical operation. Sources, who had spent years inside Hezbollah's procurement and logistics chains, would be burned the moment Hezbollah began its post-attack investigation. Relationships that had taken a decade to cultivate, the kind of patient, long-horizon asset development that produces the most valuable intelligence, would be swept away in the forensic accounting that always follows a breach of this magnitude. The people arguing for a stand down were not cowards. They were making the case that what existed was still worth protecting, even at the cost of not using it now. That preserving the architecture was worth more, in the long run, than the strike it had been built to enable. That argument lost. The pagers were already distributed. The network was already seated. The window was not closing. It was closed, or close enough to closed that waiting another week meant waiting until Iran had finished its examination and Nasrallah had been informed. Mossad Director David Barnea made the call. At 3:30 in the afternoon on September 17, 2024, pagers began beeping across Lebanon. To the people wearing them, it looked like a message alert. It looked like the kind of routine communication that came through dozens of times a day. Some of them reached for the devices. Some of them looked down. The beeping was a mass trigger signal. Within seconds, the PETN charges detonated. In markets, in hospitals, in mosques, in cars, at checkpoints. In the middle of ordinary afternoon routines, the explosions happened everywhere simultaneously. 37 people were killed in the first wave. Nearly 3,500 were injured. The casualties were not senior commanders. They were mid-level fighters, logistics personnel, support staff. The people who moved things, organized things, kept the organization's daily operations running. Hezbollah's command structure absorbed the shock and did something experienced organizations do when they are hit unexpectedly and badly. They sealed their internal communications, pulled their senior leadership into secure locations, and tried to assess what had just happened before responding publicly. That instinct, the instinct to go quiet and go deep, was reasonable. It was also, in ways that would only become clear over the following days, exactly what the operation needed them to do. The following morning, walkie-talkies exploded. Hezbollah had assumed the pagers were the attack, that the damage was done, that whatever had been compromised in the supply chain had been a single vector operation, and the vector had now been used and was finished. They were wrong. The walkie-talkies Hezbollah had been using, devices distributed through the same general procurement logic that had brought in the pagers, had been seeded through an earlier phase of the same operation. a phase that, according to former Mossad officers, had begun nearly 10 years prior. Using booby-trapped walkie-talkies, Hezbollah didn't realize they were buying from Israel. When those detonated on September 18th, the psychological effect inside the organization was something different from the first attack. The pager explosions had been a shock. The walkie-talkie explosions the next day were something closer to the sensation of not knowing what else you were holding. Nasrallah, according to the retired Mossad officer who spoke to CBS News behind a mask and an altered voice, witnessed pagers detonate next to people standing immediately beside him. He described the effect on Nasrallah not in military terms but in psychological ones. That moment was, in his words, the tipping point. What the Mossad officer meant, and what the phrasing was careful not to fully specify, was that Nasrallah made a decision in the aftermath of the pager explosions that he might not have made in any other state of mind. He called a meeting. This is the false release moment. The moment where the pressure of the previous 72 hours creates the appearance of a return to control. Senior Hezbollah commanders gathering in the underground headquarters in Dahiyeh was not, on its face, an unusual occurrence. The bunker complex beneath the residential buildings of the Heret Reik neighborhood had been built precisely for this purpose. Reinforced, deep, designed to survive the kind of conventional strike that Israeli Air Force doctrine typically employed. Nasrallah had used it before. It had held before. The logic of retreating to the most protected point you control, when you are under attack and trying to understand the scope of what has been done to you, is not a failure of judgment. It is what hardened security doctrine looks like from the inside. The commanders who entered that building on September 27th were not being careless. They were following procedures that had been validated over 2 decades of survival under Israeli surveillance. The location was secure. The access was controlled. The communication protocols for the meeting were handled through channels the leadership believed were clean. What they had not fully accounted for was that someone knew the meeting was happening. In the hours before, the Israeli Air Force repositioned its F-35s over the Mediterranean. A piece of intelligence moved. Lebanese security sources, cited by the French newspaper Le Parisien in the days following the strike, described it in specific terms. Someone with access to Nasrallah's movement schedule, not his general location, not an approximation, but the specific detail of his arrival at the Dahiyeh headquarters, in the same vehicle as Abbas Nilfarushan, the deputy commander of Iran's Quds force in Lebanon, passed that information to Israeli intelligence. The timing was precise enough to be operational, not a general indication that Nasrallah was in Beirut, not a rumor from a peripheral source. The kind of detail that only comes from someone who was inside the information chain for that specific meeting. In Israeli Air Force planning terms, that intelligence transformed the operation from a high-confidence strike on a known location into something closer to certainty. The F-35s were already armed. The BLU-109 bunker-penetrating bombs had been matched to target specifications that had been developed, refined, and updated over years of surveillance on the Dahiyeh complex. The aircraft were repositioned. The strike package was finalized. Inside the bunker, the meeting continued. The commanders present had no indication that anything had changed. The pager crisis was 10 days old. The walkie-talkie explosions were 9 days old. The immediate emergency had, in the logic of the room, passed into the category of damage already done and now being assessed. The meeting itself was the assessment, an attempt by the senior leadership to understand what had happened, what had been lost, and what came next. The assumption in that room, the assumption that would prove to be the most costly, incorrect judgment in the organization's history, was that the location was clean, that no one outside the smallest possible circle knew they were there, that the most protected man in Lebanon, in the most reinforced structure in the most fortified neighborhood in Beirut, behind 18 years of security discipline and a communications blackout, and a meeting that had been organized through channels believed to be secure, was safe. The F-35s were already in the air. The building did not fall the way buildings fall in earthquakes or fires, or the ordinary violence of structural failure. It collapsed inward. all 6 stories simultaneously, pressing down into the bunker complex beneath them as more than 80 bombs delivered in under 2 minutes drove through the reinforced ceiling that had been built to survive anything Israel could put in the air. 5 more buildings around it came down in the same sequence. The neighborhood above the bunker, the residential streets, the apartment blocks, the infrastructure of ordinary civilian life that Hezbollah had built its underground headquarters beneath for precisely the reason that it made targeting harder, absorbed the force of a strike that witnesses described feeling dozens of kilometers away. Hassan Nasrallah was confirmed dead the following morning. Abbas Nilfarushan, the Quds Force deputy commander who had arrived in the same vehicle, was dead. Multiple senior Hezbollah commanders who had attended the meeting were dead. The strike had not been a targeted assassination in the narrow sense. It had taken everyone in the room. What happened inside Hezbollah in the hours after the strike has been only partially reconstructed through sources close to the organization. What is clear is that the immediate response was not grief. It was confusion of a specific and operationally dangerous kind. No one in the surviving leadership chain had been told the meeting was happening. That was the protocol. Compartmentalization. The fewer people who knew, the safer the location. That protocol, the one that had protected Nasrallah for 18 years, had now made it impossible to know, in the immediate aftermath, who else had been in the building. Who was dead? Who might have survived and been captured? What had been said in the meeting and therefore what Israeli intelligence now knew, or might know, or might be acting on. The surviving leadership sealed itself further. Communications went to minimum. Senior figures who had not been in the building moved to secondary locations. The instinct was correct, and the instinct was also, in a way that would take weeks to fully understand, too late. 10 days after Nasrallah was killed, Israeli aircraft struck again. Hashem Safieddine, Nasrallah's cousin, the head of Hezbollah's executive council, the man widely expected to be named as the new Secretary General, was in an underground command facility in Dahye when the bombs came in. He was killed along with 26 other Hezbollah officials. The strike on Safieddine was not luck. It was not ambient surveillance that happened to find him. It required, again, specific intelligence about a specific location at a specific time. The same signature as the strike on Nasrallah. Inside Hezbollah's internal security apparatus, the question that was already circulating, who knew where Nasrallah was going to be, now had a second data point that made the answer harder to explain as a one-time breach. Someone was still talking, or the method that had produced the first intelligence was still operational, or there was more than one source, or the penetration was deeper and older than anyone had yet calculated. None of those possibilities led anywhere comfortable. Wafik Safa, the man who ran Hezbollah's liaison and coordination unit, survived an Israeli assassination attempt in October 2024. The attempt on him was itself a piece of information. It confirmed that Israeli intelligence had him identified, located, and prioritized, that his role in managing Hezbollah's relationships with Lebanese state security had made him a target, which meant Israeli intelligence understood his function in detail. He had survived the attack. He had survived the war. He had survived the ceasefire and the restructuring period that followed. In March 2026, he resigned. Sources close to the organization described the departure as the product of internal disputes. The movement issued no official statement. The nature of the disputes was not detailed publicly. What the resignation represented, read against the backdrop of everything that had happened since September 2024, was the visible surface of something that had been fracturing for longer than the public timeline suggested. A senior figure who had spent decades building Hezbollah's relationships with Lebanese institutions, who had survived an assassination attempt, who had watched the organization lose its Secretary General, its presumed successor, 5 senior commanders, and 3,500 personnel in under 2 months, walking out through an internal disagreement that no one would explain on record. Organizations that are functioning do not lose people like that quietly. By November 2024, a ceasefire was in place. Its terms required Hezbollah to withdraw its armed presence from southern Lebanon and cede that ground to the Lebanese armed forces. For an organization that had spent 4 decades defining itself through its armed resistance posture in the south, that had told the Lebanese public and the Arab world and its own fighters that its weapons were non-negotiable, that disarmament was surrender, that the resistance was permanent, accepting those terms was not a tactical adjustment. It was an admission, written into an international agreement, that the organization no longer had the capacity to refuse. In January 2025, Lebanon appointed Nawaf Salam as prime minister. Hezbollah had actively opposed his appointment. Regional analysts read his confirmation not as a political event, but as a measurement, a precise public indicator of how much institutional weight Hezbollah had lost and could no longer spend on blocking outcomes it didn't want. The organization that had, for 20 years, functioned as a state within the Lebanese state, that had its own military, its own intelligence services, its own social infrastructure, its own foreign policy, was now losing political arguments it would once have won without raising its voice. The long-term cost of what happened between September and November 2024 is still being calculated. What is already clear is that the damage did not begin with the pager explosions. It did not begin with the strike on Nasrallah. It began earlier, in the accumulated decisions of a decade, the slow penetration of an organization's procurement chains and internal psychology, the exploitation of grievances that the leadership either didn't see or chose not to address. Shorba, the man Nasrallah confirmed in 2015 and then tried to minimize, whatever he actually knew, whatever he actually passed to Mossad, was not the breach. He was the visible edge of a methodology that had been running longer than he had, and that continued after he was caught. The architecture he understood, how Hezbollah thought about its own security, did not change significantly after his arrest, because changing it would have required the leadership to admit how deeply the logic of the organization had been mapped from the inside. That admission was never made publicly. It may not have been made internally either. Somewhere, the person who passed the final intelligence, who told Israeli handlers that Nasrallah would be in that specific building on that specific afternoon, is either dead or living under a different name, or still present in some form in a world that is now entirely changed by what they did. We do not know their motive. We do not know whether they understood, when the relationship began, what it would eventually require of them. Whether there was a moment when they could have stepped back and didn't. Whether the decision, when it finally came, felt like a decision at all. Or whether it felt like the last step in a long walk that had started somewhere they could no longer clearly remember. There is a specific kind of psychological literature on what happens to people who live double lives for extended periods. Not the operatives who are trained for it, who are psychologically prepared and institutionally supported, but the people who drift into it, who begin with a grievance and a relationship and find, years later, that those two things have quietly become something irreversible. The research is consistent on one point: the damage is not to the cover. The cover can be maintained almost indefinitely by people who are motivated enough. The damage is to the person maintaining it, to the version of themselves they present to the world they have not left. The colleague they eat lunch with, the family member they call on weekends. Every interaction that requires them to be who they were before, conducted across a distance that only grows wider the longer the arrangement continues. What intelligence officers who study defection describe, consistently, is not the drama of the moment of betrayal. It is the aftermath. The way a person who has done what this person did cannot return to any version of the self that existed before. Not to the organization, not to the ideology, not to the relationships built inside it, not even to the grievance that started everything, because the grievance, once acted on at this scale, stops being a grievance and becomes something that has no clean name. Nasrallah was buried in Beirut on February 23, 2025. Hundreds of thousands attended. On the same day, the Israeli Air Force released footage of the strike. Aerial video, clinical and silent, of 6 buildings disappearing in under 2 minutes. Both things happened simultaneously. The morning and the footage, the hundreds of thousands in the streets and the 45-second clip. That simultaneity, the grief and the documentation of what caused it, released on the same morning, was not accidental. It was its own kind of message. The full identity of the person who provided the final intelligence has never been confirmed publicly. The full scope of what was taken from Hezbollah over the decade before September 2024, through human sources, through compromised supply chains, through the patient, invisible work of building a map of an organization's internal psychology, has never been fully disclosed. What has been disclosed is the result. An organization that defined itself through resistance and impenetrability, now restructuring in public, losing political battles it once won without effort, bearing a leader whose location was kept secret for 18 years until one afternoon when it wasn't. The question of how that happened, the full answer, is still, in the places where it matters, unspoken. If you want to understand why that question matters beyond this one operation, subscribe. Because the methodology used here did not end with Hezbollah, and the next time it's used it will probably look nothing like this.